I had always believed I understood what was ahead of me: life, marriage, and the slow, steady passage of time. Nothing seemed unpredictable, but I was mistaken. For months, the signs were undeniable, clear in hindsight, though I had failed to recognize them at the time. Addison, my wife of 10 years, had grown distant. Her laughter was less frequent, her touch mechanical, and intimacy had all but vanished. At first, I convinced myself it was stress. Work was demanding, and life had thrown its fair share of challenges our way. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was more beneath the surface of her cold indifference. It didn't take long for everything to fall into place. Her late nights, the sudden care she took with her appearance, the whispered phone calls. All of it painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. I decided to confront her, but not in anger. If she was done with our marriage, I would let her go. As painful as it was, I couldn't force her to stay. What confused me, however, was her refusal to leave, her insistence on dragging things out as though waiting for something. Financially, things were straightforward. Our house, a gift from my late grandmother, was in my father's name, a precaution I'd taken years earlier, anticipating that things might go wrong. It wasn't just her indifference that unsettled me. It was the deliberate way she avoided being in the same space for too long. Conversations became monosyllabic, meals were eaten in silence, and the warmth we once shared had been replaced with cold, formal distance. I found myself searching for any hint of the woman I had fallen in love with, but Addison had become someone whose eyes seemed to hide secrets too heavy to share. The hardest part was the waiting. It felt as though we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, neither of us willing to take the first step. She hovered between staying and leaving, while I tried to figure out why she was holding on. One evening, after an especially tense dinner, I sought advice from my parents. My father, ever pragmatic, leaned back in his chair and said, "Michael, if you think she's pulling away, you have two options: fight for her or protect yourself. It's that simple." My mother, with a softer but equally firm voice, added, "Keep the house in our name for now. If things fall apart, you'll thank us later." At the time, I didn't fully grasp the significance of their advice, but in hindsight, it was one of the few decisions that saved me from losing everything. The strain in our marriage reached its breaking point one night when I came home to find Addison at her vanity, applying makeup with a deliberate air. She was wearing a new, short, revealing dress, completely unlike anything I'd ever seen her wear. She didn't acknowledge my presence. I asked, "Going somewhere?" My voice trembled with the storm inside me. "Yes," she replied flatly. "I have a date." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to admit this was some cruel joke. But she didn't. She simply continued applying her makeup, as if what she had said was perfectly normal. "A date," I repeated, disbelief in my voice. "While we're still living under the same roof." She turned to face me, her expression defiant. "I've made up my mind, Michael. I deserve this, and I'm not leaving." Her words were a challenge. For a moment, I just stared, my mind reeling. Her audacity was staggering. But what unsettled me more was the cold certainty in her eyes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was declaring her intent. "You're not leaving," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You can date once you've moved out." She froze, her lipstick poised in midair. Slowly, she turned to face me again, a mocking smile curling at her lips. "What if I say no?" "Then pack your things and stay somewhere else for a few days," I replied evenly. "I'll figure out the rest, and we can discuss splitting everything later." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "I'm not going anywhere, Michael. I like this house. And when it's mine, I'll redecorate it however I please." Her arrogance infuriated me, but I kept my voice steady. "You're the one leaving, Addison, not me." Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. "We'll see about that," she said, venom in her tone. "And don't even think about coming back while I'm gone. If you do, I'll call the police and have you arrested. They'll hold you for 48 hours on a domestic violence charge." By the time you're out, I'll have changed the locks. She clearly expected me to flinch under the weight of her threat, but instead, I simply smiled. Make sure your lipstick matches the ring on the tube, I said calmly, turning and walking away. I headed to the garage, my mind racing. Her brazen attitude, her blatant disregard for the life we had built. It was enough to push anyone over the edge. But instead of lashing out, I focused on the task at hand. If she thought she could waltz out of the house for a date, she was mistaken. I grabbed my aluminum baseball bat and smashed the headlights and taillights of her car. 4 strikes were all it took to render it useless. I stood back, the faint sound of metal settling in the stillness. Her purse was on the counter, and her phone was peeking out. I rifled through it, finding only packs of rubber bands. Without hesitation, I carried the phone to the workbench and smashed it with a hammer, ensuring it wouldn't be her lifeline tonight. The rubber bands I left untouched. She couldn't accuse me of theft if they were still there. When Addison entered the kitchen, now dressed in towering heels, her smirk screamed defiance. She froze when she saw me, eyes narrowing. "Get out," she demanded, pointing toward the door. "Why would the police come?" I asked evenly. "I haven't threatened you. I haven't touched you. I've simply refused to leave my own home." She stormed out of the room. Minutes later, I heard her frustrated scream echo from the garage. "What did you do to my car?" she shouted. "Why assume I did anything?" I called back, feigning innocence. "Maybe you shouldn't leave it out on the street." She returned shortly, clutching her heels and muttering curses under her breath. "Enjoy your night," I said with a slight smile as she stormed out the door. From the living room window, I watched Addison stomp down the street, her heels dangling from one hand, her phone gone. Even from a distance, I could see her growing frustration as she knocked on the doors of neighbors, only to be turned away each time. It was almost entertaining watching her desperation grow with every failed attempt. I had already taken precautions. I called my mother, who contacted our longtime neighbors to let them know what was happening. They were all on my side, and Addison's attempts to rally their support were in vain. After about 20 minutes of wandering and rejection, she returned, lingering in the shadows at the edge of the property. I leaned back in my chair, knowing she was plotting her next move. The silence didn't last long. Soon, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car painted the walls. The officers had arrived. I opened the door to find 2 of them standing on the porch. One was Heather, a familiar face from high school, and her partner was a broad-shouldered man who looked less than thrilled to be there. Both carried the tense air of responding to a domestic disturbance call. "Good evening, officers," I said, keeping my tone light. "Let me guess, complaint about a disturbance?" Heather nodded, her expression neutral. "Michael, your wife claims you threatened her." I stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. "Come on in for coffee." They declined, their unease palpable. "She says you told her you'd ruin her life after she mentioned leaving you," Heather said. Feigning shock, I replied, "Quite the accusation. Wouldn't making a false report be a serious matter?" "It would," her partner replied cautiously. "Do you have any evidence to refute her claims?" I grabbed my phone and played a recording I had made earlier. The officers exchanged tense looks as Addison's threats echoed through the speakers, clear and unmistakable. "Well," Heather's partner sighed, "this changes things. You can definitely file for a restraining order now." Heather nodded in agreement. "You two shouldn't be anywhere near each other. Secure your house tonight and file the paperwork first thing tomorrow. If she shows up again, call us." As they turned to leave, Heather paused and fixed me with a stern gaze. "Michael, I remember you could get hot-headed back in high school. Keep your temper in check and let the courts handle this." "Yes, ma'am," I said, smirking. Sweet cheeks. Her eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" "Sorry," I said, feigning innocence. "Old habits." "Officer Sweet," I added. Her partner chuckled as they walked away, muttering, "Sweet cheeks, huh?" She didn't acknowledge him. While I was busy with the police, Addison was plotting her next move. Unbeknownst to me, she'd slipped into the garage with the intention of taking my car and leaving. However, When she realized her keys were still on the kitchen counter, her frustration reached a boiling point. She shifted her focus to my old SUV, affectionately called the Monster. It was a 1989 full-size SUV with a 454 engine and four-wheel drive. Certainly not her first choice, but desperation made her bold. She climbed inside, started the engine, and hit the garage opener button, unaware that I had disconnected the chain. Thinking the door was rising, she pressed the gas pedal. The SUV roared to life, crashing through the still-closed garage door and straight into one of the parked patrol cars outside. The impact was deafening, sending the car skidding and leaving the SUV lodged in the debris of the door. Heather had been reaching for the patrol car's door handle when the crash occurred, narrowly avoiding the chaos. Unfortunately, her partner wasn't so lucky. He was thrown 10 feet down the driveway, landing in a heap with a bloody face and a broken nose. The crash's sound was deafening, and I rushed outside to find the monster wedged in the remains of the garage door, its rear bumper pressed against the damaged patrol car. The air smelled of gasoline and scorched rubber. Officer Jones lay sprawled on the driveway, blood staining the pavement. Heather stood frozen in shock, her hand still hovering inches from the patrol car's door handle as she realized what had happened. Her expression shifted to pure fury. Without hesitation, she stormed over to the SUV, yanked Addison out by her hair, and slammed her against the vehicle. "Are you out of your mind?" she roared. Addison groaned, dazed but otherwise unharmed. Heather snapped handcuffs on her wrists and barked into her radio, "Officer down. Immediate backup needed at 411 Elm Drive. We've got a situation here." I rushed to Officer Jones, carefully cradling his head to prevent further injury. His eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again, his face contorted in pain. Blood pooled around his head as I tilted him slightly to keep his airway clear. Minutes later, the wail of sirens announced the arrival of reinforcements. The scene turned chaotic as more officers and an ambulance arrived. Heather was barking orders, her face a mask of barely contained rage. Addison, now cuffed and sitting on the curb, glared at me as if I were the one to blame. "You're unbelievable," she spat. "This is your fault." "Sure," I replied coolly, "because I made you drive through the garage door and crash into a patrol car." Her silence spoke volumes. After Heather accompanied Jones to the hospital, providing a detailed statement, Addison was taken away in another ambulance for minor injuries from the SUV's airbag deployment. I spent the next hour recounting the events to detectives, including how Addison had threatened to falsely accuse me earlier that evening. The police chief, an old acquaintance who once coached my high school baseball team, arrived midway through my statement. He listened intently before shaking his head. "Michael, you've had a hell of a night. Jones should be fine. He'll need some stitches and a reset nose, but it doesn't seem life-threatening. As for your wife, how do you even charge someone with sheer stupidity?" I allowed myself a small smile. "I guess that's for the courts to decide." Addison's reckless actions had not only damaged property and endangered lives, but they also set the tone for what came next. She was released on bail the next day, but not before draining our joint bank account to cover her legal fees and repay her parents, who had posted her bond. The $11,000 left in the account barely covered basic expenses, but I wasn't concerned. I had already secured my finances, anticipating her unpredictability. The restraining order ensured all communication went through our attorneys, which was a relief. At our first legal meeting, her lawyer presented a long list of demands, half the house's value and reimbursement for various purchases. My lawyer, armed with meticulous documentation, dismantled each claim with precision. "The house belongs to Michael's father," my lawyer explained, presenting the deed. It was never a marital asset. Addison's frustration was palpable, but she refused to back down. She demanded repayment for shared expenses, but my lawyer countered with evidence that I had personally covered the costs. Each rebuttal chipped away at her case, leaving her cornered. The courtroom became a battleground. Though Addison's case was weak from the start, every demand she made was met with evidence. Each shared expense she claimed was disproven with receipts and bank statements from my personal account. Her frustration boiled over during one session, resulting in an outburst that only further damaged her credibility. "I should have known you'd plan this," she shouted, her voice echoing in the courtroom. "You've always been calculating." I sat silently, my expression neutral. The judge gave her a pointed look. "Miss Addison, I suggest you control your tone if you want me to take your concerns seriously." By the end of the proceedings, Addison's demands crumbled. The house remained in my father's name, and her claim to it was dismissed. The judge offered her one concession. She could keep the money she drained from our joint account, provided she signed the divorce papers without further objections. Addison had no choice but to agree. The gavel struck, and with it, my freedom became official. The court's decision wasn't just a legal victory, it was a vindication of everything I had endured. The days after the divorce were quieter, but far from peaceful. Addison faced charges for filing a false police report and endangering an officer. She caught a break, managing to avoid jail time in exchange for a year of probation and mandatory counseling. From a distance, I watched as she struggled to rebuild her life. About a month after the divorce, I ran into her at a local coffee shop. To my surprise, she asked if we could talk. Reluctantly, I agreed, curious about what she had to say. "Why were you so cruel to me?" she asked, her voice softer than I'd expected. I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. "I could ask you the same thing, Addison. Why drag things out? Why not just tell me when you decided you were done?" She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "I wasn't happy," she admitted after a long pause. "I hated losing the house in the fire. I hated moving here. I hated everything. And instead of talking to me about it, you made those last months unbearable." I said, my voice steady but firm, "You wanted to hurt me, didn't you?" Her silence answered that question. "Finally," she nodded. "I blamed you for everything. And I wanted you to feel what I felt. I see now that it was wrong, but I can't undo it." "You're right," I said, standing. "You can't. But maybe you can learn from it." Years passed and life moved on. Addison remarried twice and eventually settled into a quieter life with someone who seemed to ground her. Meanwhile, I found peace in rebuilding. I reconnected with Heather, the officer who had once been my high school classmate, and over time, our friendship grew into something more. Heather and I married 9 months after our first date. She was everything Addison wasn't: kind, loyal, and fiercely supportive. Together, we built a life filled with joy and purpose. We moved into a spacious farmhouse inherited from her parents, a home that became the center of countless happy memories. Today, as I watch our daughter, Kelly, walk down the aisle, I'm reminded of how far I've come. The house that once symbolized so much pain is now hers, a wedding gift that represents a fresh start. Heather and I have plans to celebrate our 25th anniversary with a European cruise, a dream she's had for years. As I look at her now, holding a glass of water and playfully waving a small blue pill in her hand, I can't help but laugh. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the strength to rebuild is always within reach. And sometimes, the best chapters are the ones you never saw coming.